What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and today I'm going to be doing more of a discussion-based video, specifically concerning 3v3s, Time Wizard 3v3s, like the one happening at YCS Vegas coming up. Now, if you don't know, at YCS Vegas, that's either coming up or, maybe it's in the past when you're watching this video, there's going to be a 3v3 event, so people are going to be forming teams, and one person on the team will be playing a goat match, the next will be playing an Edison match, and the other will be playing a Tengu plant match. I think this is a really, really cool way to get people sort of interested in multiple formats out of Yu-Gi-Oh's history. For instance, like, a format like Goat or Edison maybe has the existing fan base to support its own sort of Time Wizard event at a YCS, but something like Tengu Plant, which is, fairly popular, but not like on too many players' radars, if they announced a YCS Time Wizard event just for this, maybe people wouldn't really show up as much. But having a 3v3 and booing a format like this with much more popular formats, I think it's a great way to get people to try out new things. And I look forward to seeing what formats they'll feature in future 3v3s. I think it's a great way to introduce people to formats that they haven't tried and may really enjoy. Now, that being said, I think while these are three natural formats to start with on the 3v3, I've naturally seen people talk about, okay, well, what are other formats that can go in a 3v3 like this? What will be featured in the future? And I think there are a lot of good options for what that could be. But given my channel has covered up to this point, namely the DM era formats, I want to talk about those in particular because I actually think that while a lot of DM era formats are really great, I think that a lot of them are not the right pick for a 3v3 event. So let me explain what I mean. Some of the most popular DM era formats happen at the very beginning of the game's history. For instance, Yu-Gi Kaiba or Critter format. Those are the formats where, Yu-Gi Kaiba is basically the first set of cards, the first limited list, and playing with a very limited card pool, playing a Yu-Gi-Oh that feels almost like its own thing, but it feels very much like Playground Yu-Gi-Oh-esque. You've got Lejin, you've got Battleox, you've got these normal monsters where attack and defense stats actually matter. And it's really, really fun, so I highly recommend people who want to experience that sort of thing try out Yu-Gi Kaiba if you haven't already. And Critter format is really, I think, where the game really starts to feel like Yu-Gi-Oh! It's just right after Yu-Gi Kaiba, Metal Raiders has been introduced, and the new limited list that corresponds with it has also been put into effect. And it's a really, really grindy format with really awesome control mirrors and surprisingly diversity of decks that can work. You've got Exodia working with your 2 Sangans, 2 Witch of the Black Forest to search out the pieces. You've got sort of, last tournament for Critter, a Labyrinth Tank Turbo deck topped, and you could argue whether that was the Labyrinth Tank part of the deck or just people playing Cannon Soldier, which is a very good card. But there's a lot of interesting experimentation to be done in Critter format, and it's definitely one of the better formats in the game's history, in my opinion. But I do think that both of these formats would actually be really bad for a 3v3 event. And here's why. If you've got people playing the Goat, Edison, and Tengu Plant matches, you want those games to go for relatively the same amount of time. Now, of course, Goat is a much grindier format than something like Edison or Tengu Plant, so I'm sure that in the event itself, the Goat games will go a little bit longer than the Edison and Tengu Plant games will. That's just a natural, sort of feature of those formats. Of course, this can change given on the match. There are some Goat games that will probably close out quicker than, an Edison or a Tengu Plant game, as there are some grindy games in those formats, especially, Tengu Plant does have a TG deck, which might be running around. So, I think that these games will probably vary in lengths, but the Goat games are generally going to last the longest, but I don't think they'll last too much longer than the other games going on there. Now, you look at something like Yu-Gi Kaiba or Critter, and those are much, much slower formats. I mentioned that Goat is a grindier format than Edison and Tengu. Well, Yu-Gi Kaiba and Critter are much, much grindier than Goat. I think the grind in Critter format is to a lot of people's enjoyment because, it's very, very resource-oriented, very, very intense. Having 2 Sangans, 2 Witches gives you a lot of resources to work with, and there's a lot of very cool plays and things that you have to keep in mind. So I think the grind there is very, very good and can be... If you enjoy control mirrors or long control games in general, Critter can be a very, very exciting format for you. But if we have like a Critter game that's going on a lot longer than the other games here, then that would be a problem. You don't want every game sort of going to time for the Critter game. And similarly for Yu-Gi Kaiba is in actually a worse spot because Yu-Gi Kaiba actually has a meta deck that is just stall mill. So basically what you do is you stall your opponent out the entire game until they draw through all 40 of your cards. Of course, those decks often play card destruction, but because you have these 2k defenders like Giant Soldier of Stone, and you have Ultimate Offering to bring out the 2k defenders, you actually are able to pull off this combo very, very well, and it can be really annoying for your opponent to deal with. And a lot of times those games will just last a really, really long amount of time because game 1, your opponent has to basically draw through their entire deck. Games 2 and 3, you can mix it up a bit, maybe throw Extreme Side into things. But very likely, those games are going to go to time in game 2, or maybe game 3. But maybe even in game 1, they'll go to time, depending on how long it takes. Now, of course, there are cards that can sort of be played in these decks to sort of take into account the time rules. A lot of online tournaments for these formats don't really play with time rules. They're just sort of like, play your match, finish whenever it's done. But in actual official tournament play, there are time rules. So, if you reach the end of the time allotted for a given match, then the player with the higher amount of life points at the end of the given phase that the round ends on will indeed be the winner. And of course, this has changed over the course of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, but I assume that for time rules, they're going to use the recent form of time rules. I mean, you could potentially say, well, in order to be completely accurate, we play with the rulings at the time, we should play with the time rules at the time. I think that's just too much trouble, and I don't think that the time rules are really as big a factor as the older rulings from the time. But I don't know if Konami's going to change their policy about that or not, but I think it makes sense to use the modern time rules, and the modern time rules will be very unkind to Yugi Kaiba. So I do think that it would be interesting to see how decks adapt to those, but also I think it would be really bad for the other two players of the 3v3 because they'll play their games and they just have to basically wait around for their third member to be done with the Yugi Kaiba game or the Critter game, and that'll be quite unfortunate. Now, I do think that maybe, something that we could do to sort of see if Yugi Kaiba or Critter could actually work in these sorts of settings is actually play online tournaments with time rules and see how that affects things. I think that, you'd see a lot more burn cards like Okazi or Just Desserts in Yugi Kaiba, and also probably people maxing out on Cannon Soldier in Critter. I mean, people generally play one copy of it anyways to close out games, but this is just, even better at 3 copies to close out games. And it can sort of serve a similar role to like Gaga Cowboy, which could either, end the game with damage or just, deal that last bit of damage to get you over your opponent in time. But I do think that, time rules would drastically affect how these formats are played, and also with Critter and Yugi Kaiba, it would lead to games ending prematurely basically every time, and that's not really that fun. So I do think that, Critter and Yugi Kaiba are great formats, and I really do hope they get a YCS Time Wizard event devoted to them at some point. But I do think that, for a 3v3, they just don't quite work. Now, that being said, I do think there are some DM era formats that would actually be quite good in a 3v3. For instance, Android format. Android format's a much more aggressive DM era format, and it's really fun. It might be like more tier 0 than Yu-Gi-Oh wants to actually have in a tournament. But I do think the tier 0 formats can be quite good, and there's still some experimentation to go on here. Also, Yada format. Yada format's personally my favorite of the DM era formats that I've covered, and I think Yada is a really exciting, diverse metagame, and the games aren't that long, even though they can be a bit grindy. Now, the one flaw with using a format like Yada that has Yatagarasu legal is that, if you've set up the Yada lock and are winning through that, your opponent could just not concede, and they could just, sort of wait out for you to do that loop like over and over. And that would, of course, make the game last much longer than it should, and that could bring games to time potentially. So that would be quite unfortunate. Now, of course, if you're the opponent who's losing to the Yada lock, it's not really in your benefit to do that because you'd be down a game for the time rules. So that wouldn't really be that good for you, but I could see that happening. So that is something that, people would sort of have to make a ruling on. Like, if you set up the Yada lock, do you just can your opponent basically have to auto concede to you, or can they just wait out the Yada to actually go through all its attacks? That's something that would probably have to be decided before a format like this was actually included in the event. Also, Chaos format, I think, would be a really iconic format to include in the 3v3. I think it's a lot of fun. And, Chaos is, I think, a tier 0 deck in it. There is some experimentation going on. But those other decks, while they can top, I think that Chaos is still the best. But the sort of degenerate like Chaos Yada combo that people remember from this format is a lot more overblown and not really as played. So I do think it would be cool to see people revisiting this format with modern eyes in a 3v3 event, and it would just be awesome to see any of these formats sort of highlighted in this way. Now, again, I'm not trying to say that they shouldn't make time-limited formats for Yugi Kaiba or Critter format. I really love those formats to death, but I do think that this would not be right for this 3v3, and if Konami does continue to do 3v3 events as their main way of introducing new retro formats into the Time Wizard pool, then I think that, you know, Yugi Kaiba and Critter probably should not be introduced in that way, and these other DM era formats that I mentioned would be a lot better for that. But, you know, this is meant to be a discussion. I'm curious to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Let me know what you think. Also, if you enjoy Retro Yu-Gi-Oh! Content, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. I generally release gameplay videos instead of just discussion videos, but I do release some discussion videos if you're interested in that. And the gameplay videos are all very fun, you know, just showing off the different formats that I've mentioned here. So if any of these formats sort of piqued your interest, definitely check out my videos on them. Also, if you want to support me directly, I do have a Patreon, link in the description down below. So big shout outs to my patrons, Rincewind, GMYFS, Bren Donker, and Porkchop I really, really appreciate your support. It really motivates me to make more videos like this. Also, if you want to play any of the formats that I mentioned in this video, then we've got a Discord server, links in the description down below, the YGO from Zero Discord server. We hold tournaments as well pretty regularly. This month's tournament will be in Android format, so if you are interested in that, definitely check it out. But I hope you enjoyed this video as always, and until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.